thing that occurred to me, really want, if you want to, just like read one of the things that we super deeply analysis of it.
Yeah.
Sure. Then you could just like do like an exegesis on us, like a critical read of something that is like confined. It's only like 30 pages instead of like doing that, trying to do that like across all the materials. Obsessed with it. Yeah.
Great. Let us go ahead and get started. So, we begin the last phase of the course, unfortunately, in the sense that we are raising questions we will not be able to answer, needless to say, in 3 days. But our goal will be to work as much as we can to put ourselves in a place where we can debate the full implications of these ideas as fully as possible. So, both Roberto and I will give brief opening comments today, and then we will devote most of today's session to a larger discussion. To begin, let me just lay out one of the key arguments we have been making in this course to hopefully help engage our discussion to come. So, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, a very standard, in fact, almost completely dominant way of thinking about world history is the standard modernity narrative. According to that narrative, all of humanity was somehow caught in some kind of a traditional world in which everything was pre-given to them. They were born into a social structure that told them what to do. They were born into a worldview that told them what to believe, and their entire lives were predefined for them. According to these narratives, which not surprisingly begin in 19th century Europe, the break occurs, of course, in 19th century Europe, where for the first time in world history, according to this view, humans begin to be able to decide for themselves how to organize the world. They become self-conscious and can decide for themselves. Are they happy with the existing social structure? And if not, how should it be changed? And they get to decide how to change it. They get to decide what to believe or what not to believe. And finally, you get, for the first time in world history, an attempt by humans to decide for themselves how to organize the world. When these modernity narratives begin, the attempt also occurring in the 19th century, of course, was to trace back to see the precursors of modernity. You will, of course, not be surprised to hear those precursors were always and exclusively in the Western tradition. So, in the very standard ones that were given, the first inklings of what would later flower into modernity begins in classical Greece, with, of course, figures like Plato and Aristotle, who begin the work of philosophy. They begin it by, at least in the case of Plato, establishing a transcendental order, that transcendental order being greater than mere customs here on the planet, gave the possibility of rational debate that eventually, over the next 2,000 years, would work out into 19th century modernity notions. We have given to you as a reading a description by Robert Brandom, a current philosopher at University of Pittsburgh, on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, which in many ways is the single most influential work that lays out this early modernity theory as it's developing in the early 19th century. And it's not a tough argument to show how most modernity narratives are picking up on pieces of the great Hegelian narrative. And in that Hegelian narrative, the narrative largely operates along the lines that I've just mentioned. However, Hegel does add in something else, which was also very important to the 19th century. Hegel wants to say that we need to account for every single idea, every single religious position, every single intellectual possibility that has ever played out in human history, because modernity for Hegel is not just the final moment of self-consciousness for humans, it also is the final collection and fulfillment and building of, a word we'll come back to momentarily, connection between every single possible idea that has ever existed. Accordingly, Hegel began a project that will also play out in various ways through 19th century social thinkers of trying to learn about philosophical and religious traditions around the world. All, of course, in translation, and the translations were hardly numerous or very good at the time. Nonetheless, he at least began that project. And in the narrative that he comes up with, you will not be surprised based upon what I've mentioned so far. So when he discusses, I'll stick with the examples we've mentioned in this course, say Buddhism, Confucianism, etc., these are all part of the pre-Greek moment. So he will lay out in the phenomenology positions like Confucianism, Buddhism, etc., all of which he very much read as pieces of a traditional worldview, just sort of working out different implications from it. And then, of course, the moment in classical Greece marks a break from this and the beginnings of the move toward full self-consciousness. And his claim, therefore, is not just that ancient Greece, of course, is better by definition than all the other traditions, but also that it incorporates by overcoming those contradictions and failures of the earlier system. So his entire way of building this up is to say ancient Greek thought contains and beats out all of these other ideas. And this, of course, is part of his grand dialectic in which he will work out human history by positions that will involve an inherent contradiction. When that is worked out, the next move works out that contradiction by connecting the two earlier elements and then continuing. Now, putting it this way, Hegel would undoubtedly, if he had heard at least a little bit of our discussion in this class, claim, and this is why, of course, we're putting it in today's reading, he would claim, well, he's pulling together a vision of self-fashioning and an ethic of connection, because the whole basis of his notion of self-fashioning is not just the individual self, although it is certainly that, but it's not just that. By definition, the self-fashioning individual is one coming at this crucial moment in history, and therefore building upon and overcoming the contradictions of all earlier thought. And by doing so, it, of course, once this final stage is being achieved, it is one of connection because it would literally connect in the sense of overcoming all previous positions. You will not be surprised to hear that we will slightly disagree with this narrative, but let me just lay out some explicit points of disagreement for where we are going. The counter view of human history that we have been developing in this semester has gone on the following grounds. That which we can call a traditional society is not a mythical notion. There have been societies that have worked this way throughout all of human history. When these 19th century modernity narratives are being given, of course, what they're looking at is the 18th century of Europe, which was largely exactly along those lines. You were born into a position within a pre-given social hierarchy. You largely did rituals to socialize you into a particular worldview. This is what they're reacting against, and it was not a complete mischaracterization of 18th century Europe. However, in trying to claim that all of human history functioned this way, the implication, needless to say, is we don't have to take seriously any idea from any part of the world because it's traditional, the only exception being those pieces of the Western tradition that are seen as precursors to the proper vision of modernity. If, on the contrary, we say there have been societies that work as traditional societies throughout world history, once we note that, we will also note immediately there have been attempts to break down these societies repeatedly. We have focused here on two of those moments. The first being, well, actually, I guess three, but the first two kind of work together. The first being this extraordinary period in the mid-first millennium BCE of the Axial Age, in which, yes, On the western side of Eurasia, Plato and Aristotle were a key part of it, but as we've noted, equally a part of it were the Buddha, Confucius, and many, many other figures that we haven't had time to get to. Those are followed a few centuries later by salvationist religions that pick up these ideas and work out their implications in terms of larger communal worlds. Christianity, of course, being a big one that we have focused on in this course, Mahayana Buddhism being another one, and we've discussed less at length, but at least a little bit to give you a sense of it, the formations of the institutionalized visions of Confucianism. Then, as we have noted, if we're going to stick to a notion of a traditional society, all of these ideas were institutionalized and domesticated in various ways. Some ways very exciting, in ways that we can hopefully build upon. Other ways very disappointing and discouraging, not surprisingly. State-based efforts to build societies aren't always going to be trying to do what we are, I suspect, philosophically hoping to do in this course. And therefore, looking at that subsequent period, sure, to return to the example of Europe, you get the reemergence of what figures in the 19th century would call traditional societies. And that is true throughout this period, but throughout this period too, you see attempts to rework those traditional worlds in different ways. Then, of course, we have focused on this second moment, or third moment, depending on how one defines the salvationist religions, but the next big moment we are focusing on is our period. And what we have tried to argue is we are in danger of falling back into a, to stick with this word, traditional world in terms of economic inequality in the world now. This is not just an American story, throughout the world. They are at levels that are quite comparable to those of 18th century Europe. In terms of levels of social mobility, sadly, the numbers are pretty similar to 18th century Europe. In terms of a pre-given worldview, I think you could argue that exists. To stick with America as the immediate example, many of these ideas of the self-fashioning tradition have been so domesticated, they've become part and parcel of just a worldview of looking within, finding your true self, loving who you are, don't change yourself, don't change the world. I'm only slightly exaggerating. And the result is, yes, we live in a world of radical income inequality, minimal social mobility, extraordinary numbers of larger problems being faced in terms of climate, etc. And meanwhile, we are de facto being told, don't change yourself and don't change the world. You could argue, I would argue, we are in danger of falling into a traditional worldview. And if that is the case, what we need is to break out of it yet again. And we have argued in this course, let's try to use those attempts to break out of them in the past, but use them powerfully, focusing not on the limited ways they've been domesticated and institutionalized, but returning to the original visions, trying to recover their power, and then asking, what would it mean for us now to try to do something equally powerful with these ideas, which would mean dramatically changing them by definition, and yet hopefully being dramatically challenged as well by the power of what they were trying to do. And that brings us to today's class. Going back to these modernity narratives, these are dangerous for us in two ways. In terms of the model of self-fashioning, the danger of the modernity narrative is it is a domestication of them. The danger is we will fall back into thinking, well, we're already modern, so we're kind of there. And we have argued strongly, we are not there. And the ways these ideas have been domesticated in America and elsewhere is hardly living up to the extraordinary power of these ideas. And of course, if we want to take seriously an ethics of connection, the problem of the modernity narrative is the exact opposite one. By definition, that becomes pushed aside as part of a traditional way of thinking, and there we need to ask, what would it mean to take an ethics of connection that would be as radical and revolutionary as we need it to be to radically rethink and alter the world we are living in? Thus, today, we, having spent this semester hopefully building up this argument, we now engage in this debate. And it's a several-fold debate, and I'll just lay out some of these questions, and we will see that we allow the discussion to go as it goes. First of all, returning to a question we've been looking at in more depth, what would it mean? This, of course, was the focus of the last 3 or 4 courses. What would it mean to take these two visions, self-fashioning and ethics of connection, into their strongest possible form today? How would we debate between them? Are there possible places of convergence and merging, or are they radically different? If the former, how would we connect them in any way? If the latter, how would we choose between them? And regardless of how we choose to make that decision, what would be the implications for moral worlds, political, economic worlds? We're focusing primarily on the former, but it will bleed very quickly into the latter as well, were we to follow either or both of these ethics. So our questions are, what would this mean to resurrect these ideas in their full power? Do we try to connect them, or do we see them as radically distinct? And what are the implications of these ideas and the implications of our decisions to connect them or keep them distinct? So, with that as a very brief overview of where we have come and where we are hoping to go in these next 3 sessions, let me turn things over to Professor Unger, and then we will open things up.
Yeah, so our topic today is the synthesis or impossibility of synthesis of these 2 moral visions that we have been discussing, the ethic of self-fashioning and the ethic of connection. I want to begin by saying a word about the Hegelian narrative first, and as it is interpreted, summarized by Brandom in the reading for today. So Hegel had this view that there was some early moment in the evolution of humanity, in the development of spirit of the human race, in which we had an uncomplicated, unresisting identification with the social practices and the social institutions. So that's the moment in which subjectivity has not yet arisen. And we are invaded, we are penetrated by this objective social world, and we do not experience any contradiction to it. Then there is a path, which is the path of history, in which gradually subjectivity emerges in the human being. And with the emergence of subjectivity comes the experience of contradiction. The contradiction between the drive towards subjectivity, towards subjective consciousness, toward freedom, and this world of social practices and institutions. A series of contradictions in which we begin to develop different views of ourselves, and we experience those views as being in contradiction to society and in contradiction among themselves. And that long period of the ordeal of humanity in history, Hegel describes as estrangement. This is the spirit in estrangement. Now, those 3 sources of trouble that I described in the way things are, when the ideal of reciprocity in the ethic of connection turns out to be insufficient to shape our relations to one another, amount to a description of what the content of estrangement is. So we could bring the content of estrangement under those 3 labels of subjugation, disunion, and coldness. And then, according to Hegel, there is a final moment in which, with the evolution of both our subjective freedom and of society, there is a reconciliation of subjectivity to society. So we can be free in this final moment. We can We can, in this sense, be ourselves, but at the same time accept society. There's a reconciliation of social order and subjectivity. Now, what is one to say about this hopeful narrative? Maybe I shouldn't call it hopeful because it's fatalistic, and hope is about the future, not about the past. But it is, let's say, a rosy narrative about what has happened to us up to now. So the first problem is that there was never a moment in the evolution of humanity when we could have an uncomplicated relation to subjectivity. There's never this primeval garden, this paradise of before the emergence of subjectivity. So long as we were human, one might say, we always experienced a surfeit of possibility, of yearning, of demand in us. There was always more in us, in each of us individually, and in all of us collectively, the human race, than there is or ever could be in the social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. It's true that the subsequent evolution of culture inflamed this experience of subjectivity, but in some early form, we must assume that it was always there. The second criticism of the Hegelian narrative is that that narrative attributes a canonical significance to the European form of the transformation from the beginning to the end, from the moment in which subjectivity spontaneously coincided with society to the moment in which we can have subjective freedom accepting society, because society and freedom have become the same thing. So in that path, the path of the ordeal of estrangement, Hegel attributes decisive significance to the forms that it supposedly took in European history. And this also is false. There is no single trajectory that takes us from the first stage to the last stage. The third objection to the Hegelian narrative, and perhaps the most profound, is that this final stage, as Hegel describes it, does not exist. There is no moment at which we will be at home in the world. There is no moment at which the organization of society and our situation in the world will entirely accommodate us. We will always be homeless. And this homelessness, this inadequacy of the world, to us, is part of the condition of our freedom. So it will always be true that the world is not enough. The lemma, non sufficit orbis. The world does not suffice. The world will never suffice, one could say, commenting on this denouement of the Hegelian narrative. So, given those facts, if they are facts, then how are we to account for our situation in the world? The situation is very serious. So we are told, for example, by the Semitic monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that we have a friend in charge of the universe. Some of us may think that this news is too good to be true. And if it's not true, then we are in this situation in which we are plunged into darkness, into a nature, a cosmos, which is fundamentally indifferent to us. And not only indifferent to us, but which is out to annihilate us. So we are informed by the life sciences that the individual must die so that the species can survive. And this is certainly very bad news. Annihilation is the condition for the persistence of life. But it's not just nature outside of us that we encounter, it's nature inside of us, equally alien. Now, let me read you a passage from Marcel Proust, The Remembrance The Remembrance of Time Lost. And it's from the volume The Guermantes Way. Here's the passage. I went upstairs and found my grandmother not so well. For some time past, without knowing exactly what was wrong, she had been complaining of her health. It is in moments of illness that we are compelled to recognize that we live not alone, but chained to a creature of a different kingdom, whole worlds apart, who has no knowledge of us and by whom it is impossible to make ourselves understood. Our body. Say that we met a brigand along the way. We might yet convince him by an appeal to his personal interest, if not to our own plight. But to ask pity of our body is like discoursing before an octopus, for which our words can have no more meaning than the sound of the tides, and with which we should be appalled to find ourselves condemned to live. So this is the circumstance in which we encounter nature, alien and hostile to us outside, and then within us in the form of the body, of the dying body. So if we are unable to bring ourselves to believe this news, that we do have a friend in charge of the universe, what are we to do? And this is the terrible question to which the two ethics that we've just considered attempt to give a response. And I've argued that the strongest versions of each of these ethics are indeed closer to each other in some respects, but in making them stronger, we also make their fundamental distinctions appear all the more clearly. And there is no final synthesis, I would say, between them. So one of these responses, the response of the ethic of connection, says, in this situation, surrounded by an alien and hostile nature, and undermined from within by nature in the form of the dying body, all we have in the end is one another. And we must attempt to live in one another's arms. This is the only solution. The only solution is solidarity. With an objective element, we acquire the second nature, this social nature, superimposed on our original antisocial nature, and a subjective element, we develop our imaginative insight into the otherness of the others. And then we've discussed the difference between two versions of this response. I call them the minimalist and the maximalist. One of the differences between these versions has to do with the extent to which they accept the existing inherited organization of society as the template on which we are to affirm our connection, our solidarity with one another, as opposed to insisting on its transformation. The maximalist and the minimalist response differ in the audacity, in the radicalness of their transformative intentions. The second difference between these two responses has to do with the acceptance of contradiction, of the contradictory conditions of self-assertion. The maximalist response insists that there is contradiction between our need for the others and the jeopardy in which they place us, between the imperative of engaging in a particular social and cultural world and the need not to surrender to that world, insisting that we be insiders and outsiders at the same time, and the contradiction between the need to form a coherent way of being, a character, but at the same time to disrupt it. So the combination of the transformative intention with the recognition of the imperative of contradiction and of reckoning with these contradictions separates the minimalist from the maximalist forms of the ethic of connection today. And what about the other response? The response of the corrected, augmented ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity. It says, somehow we have to live in such a way that we can die only once. We are going to die. We will be annihilated. But so long as we are alive, we should be deathless. Our aim should be the intensification of life. We should come more fully into the possession of life now, not just in the future. And to come into the possession of life now, we must pay a price, the price of a heightened vulnerability. And our relations to one another will be transformed by this conception of the enhancement, the intensification of life. So those are the two views that we're considering. They take very different directions. They can overlap in some ways, but they remain antagonistic to each other in other ways. It's possible to imagine that they would be entertained simultaneously by the same individual, so that we could believe in both of them, although we were unable to synthesize them. So synthesis is an easy rhetorical operation. It's a matter of the manipulation of words. But underlying these words are real things and real contradictions, which it is not in our interest to conceal. Now, anticipating then the argument at the end of the course in the last class, but also recalling where we began in the first class, we have the problem that we described as the cognitive gap. The only question that no individual can escape is, how should he live his life? There's no way of escaping that question, of not answering it. Because if we don't answer it explicitly, we will answer it implicitly by the way in which we in fact live. There's no other question like that one that we are unable to evade. So we must answer it. And then it is, and in answering it, we discover that we have always reasons to prefer one view to another view. So what are these reasons? One reason is, does it resonate with our strongest yearnings, our aspirations? Those that are least pliable, that are least variable. The second is it consistent with what we independently know to be the facts about ourselves? Or does it, on the contrary, depend on some illusion? And the third kind of reason we could have to prefer one of these views to another view is that it operates, in fact, as a self-fulfilling prophecy. So all of these moral conceptions that we've been considering during the semester have this element of being self-fulfilling prophecies. They say, believe in me. And if you believe in me and act on me, you will make the world more like the way I say it is. So then there's a question. Will the prophecy, in fact, be self-fulfilled or not? When we act on these beliefs, what will happen? Will the world, in fact, the world outside of us and within us, will it in fact become more like the way that the prophecy says it is? Or will these views turn out in some way to be self-subversive, to deny themselves, and to produce a surprise which undermines them? So if we apply these criteria, these forms of argument, to the two views we've been considering and to other views like them, they do provide some guidance. But it seems to turn out that the guidance is always inadequate. That a gap remains between the fateful question, the fateful weight of the question, how should I live? And the inadequacy of the reasons that we could give in favor or against. That gap is what I call the cognitive gap. So we have, for example, good reasons to reject the uncorrected form of the ethic of self-fashioning. Like, it has an empty conception of autonomy. It says we should be free, but free to do what? And so then we correct this. We say the content comes from our engagements and our attachments in the light of our epiphanies, of our discoveries about the transformative possibilities of experience. And we correct the minimalist form of the ethic of connection because it fails to recognize the contradictory characters of this conditions of self-assertion, and because it inappropriately accepts the established form of society as the template for the realization of our moral vision. But then we're still left with this divergence between the corrected form of the ethic of self-fashioning and the maximalist form of the ethic of connection. And it's possible that we would be unable to resolve that divergence, and that we would be simultaneously attracted to both these views, and that they would continue to coexist in our minds in the form of an enduring duality in our moral consciousness. And this fact, if it is a fact, or if it were a fact, would complicate still further our basic situation. Plunged into this darkness, on the way to death, surrounded by a hostile nature, and with this hostile nature inside of us in the form of the body, and unable to obtain some decisive moral light. So that's what I wanted to say by way of introducing our conversation.
Wonderful. Let's throw it out. Comments, questions? Let's throw this out. Comments, questions, thoughts? Please.
So Hegel's final stage of history, where freedom and social order are reconciled, kind of sounds like, Professor Unger, your proposal in response to your critique of the American Romantics, where you said, let's not just focus on transcending structure, but let's build a structure that supports the spirit. How are you different from Hegel in that way?
Because I don't, because that's not the description of a detailed set of arrangements, right? That's saying, so one of the points of departure for that idea is the criticism of the liberal notion of a neutral order of right. So there, according to that notion, there are conflicting visions of the good, but there is an impersonal framework of right that is neutral with respect to these visions of the good. Now, I then say, no institutional order is neutral. Every institutional order tilts the scales, encouraging some forms of experience and discouraging others. And in fact, the ideal of neutrality is always in the service of its opposite. Because by claiming neutrality for the institutional order, we are insulating it against attack and revision, and thus ensuring that it will be the opposite of neutral. So that's what then leads to an idea that there is a weaker, more acceptable, more valid counterpart to the false idea of neutrality. The counterpart is that the social order should be open to a wide range of contradictory experience, and that it should have the attribute of corrigibility. It should be susceptible to correction, and it should facilitate its own correction. But that's not the description of some final state of rest. That's not the description of any particular set of institutions. That's the description of an order that is perpetually contestable and subject to revision. So on that view, some orders are better than others, and but no order represents this Hegelian idea of the reconciliation of subjectivity with society. So it's not the same thing on my view. And now let me say one more thing, because place it in a somewhat more elaborate idea historical context. So in the 19th century, the liberals and socialists all believed that there was a preferred set of institutional arrangements, and that if we establish those arrangements, the ones that John Stuart Mill recommended or the ones that Karl Marx recommended, we would have both freedom and prosperity. We would have a pre-established harmony, a guaranteed convergence between the achievement of our moral interests in the emancipation of humanity and our material interests in the development of our practical productive powers. Now, we have come to be skeptical about that. And we may be tempted then to embrace the opposite dogmatism, that there is a tragic contradiction between the institutional conditions for our material development and the institutional conditions for our moral emancipation, our freedom. But that would be equally arbitrary. So then comes the idea that there is a possible zone of intersection between the institutional conditions for the pursuit of our moral interests and the institutional conditions for the pursuit of our material interests. That there is some subset of the institutional requirements for economic growth, for example, that also satisfies our interest in emancipation, and some subset of the institutional requirements of emancipation that also serves our material progress. And what we should desire then on that account would be to travel, to identify this zone of intersection and to travel in it, to progress in it. And that would then be an account of the possibility of progression, which is nevertheless not perfectionist. It doesn't point to some final state in which we can realize everything. Now, what is the characteristic of the institutions that are in this zone of intersection? And you might say one of their characteristics is that they are experimentalist. So they would be arrangements that facilitate their own revision. Thus the idea of a structure that subverts itself or changes itself. And the intuitive kernel of that idea is that this quality of laying themselves open to challenge and change is likely to be a basis of material progress, because the more freedom we have to recombine not just the factors of production, but the institutional arrangements that enter into the framework of production and change, the more likely we are to be successful in our material pursuits. And simultaneously, if we have freedom to challenge the institutional arrangements on which every entrenched scheme of social division and hierarchy depends, it's also more likely that we'll succeed in our pursuits of emancipation. So, and that then is a way of saying that, of defining a very special characteristic of our contemporary situation, which is this: like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, and unlike the institutionally conservative social democrats and social liberals of the late 20th century, we have reason to affirm the primacy of structural alternatives. over non-structural alternatives. Reason to believe that it's not enough to humanize the market order, it's necessary to innovate in its legal and institutional constitution. But unlike those liberals and socialists, we have reason to resist entrusting our social future to some institutional dogma like they did. And so reducing that to a formula, we could say, we have reason to affirm structural alternatives or structural commitments, but also to resist the structural dogmatism. And that's a unique situation. That's a situation without historical precedent. This is in the realm of politics. So all of that together, those ideas together, seem to me to define a position which is quite different from the Hegelian position. But it still leaves open this unresolved contest of moral visions. Coming back to the idea that, in a sense, politics is easier than morals because it is susceptible to progression in a clearer and more decisive sense.
Please.
So, if I hear you correctly, you would like to keep the progressive narrative of history, well, minus the teleological spin.
So when you say progressive narrative, it's the possibility of progression, not the necessity of progression, right?
Sure, the construction, the concrete existence of some social,
Yeah.
cultural, political
Yeah.
achievements that he could discern how he connected them and whether the connection was.
Because of course the Hegelian narrative is retrospective. So it looks back and it brings you up to the front. Philosophy is the owl of Minerva. It always comes later. It's always belated. And whereas in this exchange that I just had here with your classmate, the focus is our attitude to the future. The future is open. And
The radical contingency and revisability of institutional life form is something that should be powering our imagination, giving us confidence. So in some sense, you want to radicalize the Hegelian vision much more. It's like you almost want to privatize history itself by making it material for self-authorship.
yes, but with the very important proviso that very quickly everything can go off the rails, right? So let's remember the maxim of the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, which I love. He says, "The business of the future is to be dangerous," and so this is very important, and this is very different from the Hegelian idea. Hegel says at the end, we're already there. We're in this situation of reconciliation. And I answer, we're not even close. So it's a different attitude.
It's not that there isn't a necessity for thinking collectively. Obviously there is. But the question, I think presented by American society and Western, the whole world perhaps, is how much? Where are you going to draw as to how we live our lives question? Where are we going to draw the boundaries of how much we're going to live for our own personal identity, creativity, ambitions, and how much are we going to live as a collective with full respect for each other?
Well, so I followed you until you got to the very end there. So were you drawing a contrast between living our own lives and living for the others? What was the kind of contrast?
Not a contrast as much as a spectrum. Like, I think when we choose how to live our lives, we find ourselves in a spectrum. Throughout the course, throughout thinking about existence, we try to figure out where do we want to be on the spectrum.
Uh-huh.
And I'm asking for advice on how to look at that issue.
But is it the spectrum between living for others and living for oneself? Is that the spectrum you have in mind, or what? So I think there is this fundamental difference in the point of departure of these two moral visions, right? That for the vision, for the ethic of connection, the point of departure is joint intentionality. It's the logic of the interpersonal. That's the primitive element in the system. And that's the source of authority, of ultimate reality. It's the organizing principle. In the other moral vision of the ethic of self-fashioning, we must connect to the others. There's a recognition of that contradictory character of self and others. But we are ultimately alone. We're encased in these dying bodies. We face death alone. So the point of, I think that difference in the point of departure is never completely overcome. And that has implications. So the aim then is to intensify life, to die only once. And now, in the present moment, not in some collective future. And I think that's a difference that remains in all versions, in all the strongest versions of these two moral positions.
So in the end, there is no synthesis because you're going to choose which of those two wins for you.
Yes, not just on this dimension, not just on this question, but on a series of other questions also. So I think, for example, just to give you an example of another problem. So in all these strong versions of the ethic of self-fashioning, the individual has to be able to terrorize himself by confronting the ineradicable flaws in the human condition. Our mortality, our groundlessness, and our insatiability. So, by confronting them, he wakes up from his slumber, the slumber of conformity, the slumber of service to society, to convention, and so forth. So, authenticity, or self-arousal, is inseparable from this confrontation. In the ethic of connection, one might think that the dwelling on this terror is a moral luxury that takes us away from one another. And that's another example of a difference in moral sensibility, in moral vision, with practical implications. So it could be that as I said, the same individual could have both these views at different moments in his life, at different moments of his day. And it's not required that these views be established in different minds, in different selves. Why? if there's if there is this cognitive gap for which I argued, and if we're unable at the end to demonstrate the superiority of one of these views over the other, that has consequences as well for the individual.
This is a bit of an unformed question, so bear with me. Is there anything that could change your mind about the capacity or the potential for synthesis, namely in the realm of metaphysics or ontology? So, like, if you were to change your ontological priors to, say, like, an Advaita Vedanta perspective, non-dual metaphysics, would that hypothetically be able to change some of your assumptions?
Yes.
Possible? Or even like technology. Could new technologies align incentives such that these ethics can converge? Or even biology, could like complexity science show how things converge? Do you see what I'm trying to point at?
Well, I'm not sure. So let's take the example of philosophy, classical philosophy. What we called at the beginning of the course philosophical superscience. So we have the teachings of the great philosophers, the metaphysicians. And it's a bracing experience to inquire into their moral views, because I think it's not too unfair to say that what characteristically happens in these philosophers is that an unsurprising conclusion, namely the defense of some form of altruism or universal benevolence, is dressed up in an implausible metaphysics. So the general recommendations of the philosophers are benevolence, altruism, but there's some highly contrived metaphysical construction that gets you there. So that's the philosophical superscience. Now, those who, I think it was Badiou who called this the anti-philosophers. The anti-philosophers are people like Pascal, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Rousseau. The anti-philosophers have less pretense to this philosophical superscience, less of a tendency to dress up their moral ideas in this contrived construction. And their conclusions are often more novel and surprising as a result. So what I'm saying would apply less to them than it would to the classical metaphysicians. Then we have what we called at the beginning the school philosophy, with its moralistic legalism, its presentation of a bill of our moral liabilities, our obligations. It's a Pharisaical teaching dressed up in circular reasoning. So it's a different form of disappointment that we have when we engage in the study of the school philosophy, consequentialism, deontology, and social contract. So the conception of ethics, which we've tried to work on here, is a different conception. And it's a conception in which ethics, understood in this way, includes in itself the sociology of morals, the history of morals, but it's asymmetrical because the sociology of morals or the history of morals is not itself normative or is not itself a form of ethics. But every ethics has to include a sociology of morals. So it's a different conception of the field. I don't know whether that's responsive to your question.
So like partly.
Uh,
If we were to make some sort of breakthrough in how we understood the nature of reality through something like a quantum theory,
yes.
could that theoretically essentially reinvent the wheel for what is
It could.
possible for ethics?
Yeah, it could. It could. And, you know, I think one of the mysteries is that these ethical discussions occur against the background of this world history of philosophy. And in the world history of philosophy, there are two dominant positions. There's the position which I called the philosophy of deep structure. It's the Greek philosophy of being, which it says, and then there's the other position of ancient India, but also present in the West, of the philosophy of the timeless one. These are the two dominant positions in the world history of philosophy. And so for the philosophy of deep structure, time is real, but not too real. Because what is most real, which is the basic constituents of nature, and the regularities that govern these constituents are outside of time and immutable. And it's very strange that this idea persists. It persists in the physics of the 20th century, in relativity and quantum mechanics, despite the immediately subsequent discovery of the historical character of the universe. So we know enough now to think that the basic structure described by the standard model of particle physics and what we understand to be the laws, constants, and symmetries of nature could not have operated in the form in which we know them very early in the history of the present universe. But nevertheless, fundamental physics, which after all remains the queen of the sciences, continues to be practiced by this anti-historical method. So that's one view. So the other view of the timeless one also affirms the unreality or shallowness of the phenomenal distinctions and changes in the world. So what those both views have in common is to associate reality with timelessness. The more temporal something is, the less real it is, according to them. I think there's no reason to believe that that view is true. That there's better reason to believe that everything that exists in the world is temporal and no less real on that account. So we would then have to dissociate reality from timelessness. And that's a better metaphysical backdrop to the kinds of moral discussions that we're having. But it is the most undeveloped position in the world history of philosophy. So I would say that I think that's what we have most reason to believe. But if we develop that view, where does it take us? It doesn't solve our problem. Because you seem to be suggesting that there would be some breakthrough in our philosophical or scientific insight that would allow us to close the cognitive gap in morals, for example. And I suppose one can't rule it out, but I can't see what it would look like, because the breakthrough that seems to me to be most plausible on our present understanding would go in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I really appreciate that distinction of the three worldviews
Mhm.
of histories. Especially, I think you've spoken quite a lot about 2 and 3. I guess my worldview is maybe that it's like Taoist or like Whiteheadian in the sense of like awaiting novelty, but like almost like trusting in the emergent evolutionary properties of reality to solve for some of these issues that maybe our current human cognition can't fathom.
Uh-huh.
That, I mean, I always think about like the emergence of water. You have hydrogen and
Well,
oxygen.
it's certainly possible. It's certainly possible. So when one could have this view, which is sometimes described as panentheism, as opposed to pantheism. So pantheism is the view that the world is sacred, the cosmos. Panentheism is the view that the sacred is the world plus something. Now, the plus could be thought of spatially or temporally. So spatially, it's like God is an efflorescence, a radius around reality. But you can also think of it temporally. Under the lemma, you haven't seen anything yet. So the world is emerging, and the divine is something which is being created over time. That's the idea that it's the future. So that's, to us, at least to us in the West now, that would be a more attractive version of panentheism. But a hopeful view, I suppose. And a view which says there's always this possibility of the creation of novelty. And our idea of the possible is really a kind of retrospective commentary on these past novelties. That's how we form our idea of the possible. But it's not as if there was some horizon of possible states of affairs that was established now that's contrary to this logic of emergence. Something new can happen that can break everything. So it could be. I just don't see how that's going to resolve our problem. Because we have here, to simplify, I described 2 problems, right? One problem is that we are, the deck is stacked against us. We have this nature outside of us and inside of us, and it's out to annihilate us. It's going to crush us. And we can try and put the best light on that. And if we are unable to put the best light on it, to make as much of life while we have it as we can. Then there's the epistemic or epistemological problem that we don't know what's going on. So we're surrounded on every side by this impenetrable darkness, which we can penetrate only at the edges. And why are we here? What are we doing? So this is this dreamlike and vertiginous character of human existence. So the combination of those 2 problems, as it were, the ontological problem and the epistemic problem, are they define our predicament. So a great deal of metaphysics has been an attempt to explain those 2 problems away, right? It's not as bad as it seems to be, and so forth. But I think it is as bad as it seems to be. Yes.
So one thing I was thinking about is whether there's kind of like a limiting case for like so we're talking about the conduct of life, and I think a big part of it is talking about the conduct of human life as it is today. And I guess I was thinking about, can you say something if it's not human life? Like if there's like other sentience, like if there's like some AI or aliens or something. Like what you were talking about the philosophical super science. Like you might have to make something
Yes.
up, and it might just be impossible to come up with anything. And then I was thinking about, so if that's the case, then if over time like biology changes or other sentience emerges, then that means that we would be going towards a case of not being able to say anything about ethics, like you would lose kind of, I think, this human biological grounding. And I guess I don't know. Maybe the question is, do you think that there can be anything that can be said in that case, and also whether there might be an ethic of trying to avoid that case altogether?
Could you begin answering, Michael? I'll be right back. I'll come back.
Absolutely. So let me say a few words. So to do so, let me also go back to the previous question too, because they're actually interrelated. So if you look back to when I mentioned very briefly a couple of weeks ago when we were discussing Confucianism, an early kind of critic, but he's really someone who is building on Confucianism into what would later be called Taoism, the figure called Zhuangzi. And the argument very quickly, exactly as it was laid out before, is along the following lines. And this will seem like a very odd way to begin the answer to your question, but bear with me for a couple of minutes. So very quickly, the argument is very much like we were discussing with Confucianism, but the critique of Zhuangzi was that was overly humanly based. And the argument was, think of everything as endless sets of energies interacting. Everything. So anytime we perceive a thing as a thing, it is we mistakenly taking a momentary conglomeration, accumulation of energies as being something stable. Now, empirically, it may be for a brief moment of time, but even that brief moment of time, what exists because of its relationship to absolutely everything. And needless to say, this follows directly as we saw with Confucius. If you're trying to train yourself to think this way, ethically, it is all about relationships and refining relationships, connecting better, building in aspects of care to relationships, trying to train oneself not to think of oneself as an individual, trying in a Zhuangzian sense not even to think of humanity as somehow radically distinct from everything else that exists. Everything is energies. Moreover, since everything is energies, even concepts like the self, the soul, are potentially very dangerous. We have multiple souls. We therefore have potentially multiple selves in the sense that we could develop in all sorts of radically distinctive ways. In different situations, we will be in radically different sorts of relationships. So your ethics is building out of that. And the notion of emergence is therefore crucial. So if everything is relationships, think of everything that exists right now as an emergence from those sets of relationships. So everything is always emergence. A common term that I'm sure you've heard is the notion of the way, the Tao. And the notion is think of everything that we see around us as emergence from the Tao, which is an ongoing, constant process, which means everything we do helps lead to more emergences. I mean, this strains our English, obviously, to put it this way, but every relationship we're a part of helps to breed something else. And the danger of this, of course, is those relationships harden, we harden into set patterns and rote ways of being, and we cease to relate, which stops the process of emergence. Now, again, this will sound like an absurd way of answering your question, but finally, let me now turn to it. So within this way of thinking, then The answer is yes. Even that distinction, and this is Zhuangzi's explicit critique of Confucius, even the claim that we humans deserve a somehow separate type of ethic from everything else, and we are inherently different from everything else, is an incredibly dangerous view that, by definition, is based exclusively on the perspective of being a human. And Zhuangzi will therefore write his work, as we mentioned, intentionally trying to break us from human perspectives, constantly trying to break us from this limited view, which means that yes, an ethics for Zhuangzi is about relationships with everything, absolutely everything. And even that way of putting it doesn't quite capture it, because of course it isn't everything, because that's thinking in terms of things in a conglomeration. It's everything without the word thing. Again, this strains our English. You are trying to work an ethics of connection where everything you do is inherently affecting everything else, and you were trying to work out an ethics of what that would mean. And by definition, from our limited perspective, we will constantly be failing, but then the goal is you endlessly try to increase the possible perspectives to break down as many of those limitations as humanly possible. And let me just quickly add, as we're waiting for Roberto to come back, so when Roberto was saying both of these ethics come out of a similar view, that there's a world of nature, that world of nature is hostile to we as humans, and because, or at least our soul, and because our soul is kind of in an endless battle with the ultimate annihilation that waits us because of this hostile nature. That is true of nature out there and nature of our bodies. Needless to say, coming out of the traditions we're discussing, you would think about all of these issues very differently. There is a fundamental problem, but it would be phrased very differently. So it's not, there isn't even a term that immediately translates well as nature in classical Chinese. The closest you would get would be Zuran, which is basically self-soness, things as they are spontaneously. But what this means is a world of endless spontaneous interactions. That is what exists all the time. And as we've seen, one of our dangers is that we will just intuitively, that's putting it almost too politely, our danger is we will fall into patterned ways of being in the world, which will mean we are not actively responsive. So our Zuran, our spontaneous way of being in the world, will actually not be spontaneously interacting. It will be one of just responding by rote pattern. And so the problem is you're trying to learn to be responsive and resonant, and then you're trying to train yourself to work with the world knowing that what you're doing is going to radically affect everything around you all the time. And the ethics comes out of that, which is a very different way of framing the problem than an inherent contradiction with a hostile nature. Nature isn't itself hostile. It's a messy world as we are a messy world, and the ethic is one of connection writ large, of trying to respond better, to resonate better, and working from there. All of which is a preface to, but actually we'll let you rest as another question, then we'll turn to Roberto. Please, jump in. Oh, I'm sorry, you're being...
You were going to fill me in on what happened while I was out.
Yes. So I took a long excursus through the ethics of connection, through Confucianism and Taoism, as we're waiting your response. Would you like to respond immediately, or should we do another question and then come back? Up to you entirely.
We'll come back.
Yeah, we'll circle back. So yeah, let's jump to another question.
I really don't understand the connection with the social contract theory. what you have in mind there.
It seems like people are democratically deciding what's good and what's right.
I don't see it that way. I don't see it as just an open field in which there's they from scratch are deliberating on different possibilities. I think that in any real society, you start from a particular institutional background and you go from there. So we have now a series of, we're going to discuss this next week. It's the agenda for next week. So, and just by way of anticipating it, we could say this moral discussion that we're having in the course occurs in a particular moment in the political history of humanity. So the last, in the rich North Atlantic countries, the last great moment of institutional and ideological refoundation was the social democratic or social liberal settlement of the mid-20th century. And the way you could understand it is to say there was a retreat from any attempt to reshape fundamentally the worlds of power and of production. And in exchange for this retreat, there was a project to rationalize and humanize the market order through compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer, through regulation, and through counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policy. Now, none of the fundamental problems of the contemporary societies can be resolved within the limits of that institutionally conservative social democracy. None of them. So, for example, the problem of the hierarchical segmentation of the production system between vanguards and rearguards. We now have a new advanced practice of production, the knowledge economy, but instead of spreading and deepening, it's confined to exclusive fringes that lock out the vast majority of workers and businesses. And the result is both economic slowdown and an aggravation of economic inequality. Then social cohesion. So when there are migratory flows, as in the European countries, the inadequacy of money as a social cement is exposed. Money is not enough. Social transfers orchestrated by the state against the background of a very high level of ethnic, cultural homogeneity. That was the basis of social cohesion in the European societies. The only adequate basis is direct engagement of people in one another's lives, to take care of other people, to work with other people, and so forth. And then politics, the organization of democratic politics. The basic temper of European life is that there is change, or there was change when there was war. So the Europeans woke up when they were slaughtering one another, and then when universal peace was reestablished, they went back to sleep and drowned their sorrows in consumption. So that was the basic rhythm of life in these European societies. And so we need a kind of democratic politics, a high energy democracy that doesn't need crisis to make change possible. We don't have that either. So all of the basic problems of the contemporary societies require a reopening of the terms of the social democratic or social liberal settlement. So this moral debate that we're having in the course occurs at a precise moment in the history of the advanced societies when the limits of the present political compromiser have been exposed. and there would have to be a fundamental change of political direction, institutional alternatives, but no longer in the 19th century form of these. Because the 19th century form proceeded on the basis of a false idea of alternatives, namely the idea that the institutional systems are indivisible, and therefore there is a binary idea of politics. Politics is either the reformist management of a system, or it is the revolutionary substitution of one system for another. That's the Marxist idea. And it supposes falsely that structural change, when it happens, is always systemic change. So then we get the idea that change that's not systemic is shallow, and real change is systemic change, is the replacement of capitalism by socialism or something like that. All of those propositions are, to my mind, false, because real structural change in history is almost invariably piecemeal, but can nevertheless become revolutionary in its outcome if it persists in a certain direction. Now, the question raised by these remarks is this: what is the implication for our moral debate, the debate between these two positions, of that political history that I just summarized? That is, I don't know how we should think about the relation between the contest of moral visions and these new political alternatives. I'm tempted to think that the political alternatives that we require, a high energy democracy that no longer needs crisis to make change possible, a deepened and disseminated knowledge economy, a knowledge economy for the many, rather than the insular knowledge economy that we now have, and a practice of a basis of social cohesion in the multiplication of forms of collective action. I'm tempted to think that that progressive alternative in politics could be associated with either the maximalist form of the ethic of connection or the corrected form of the ethic of self-fashioning, so that there would be different moral and philosophical bases or supports for this similar political position. That's the view to which I'm inclined. So that we could, people who have this fundamental diversity of ethical views could nevertheless converge in this political direction. And then we would be left with a moral disparity which has consequences for the life of the individual. Yes?
I have a question about Confucius. One of the things that, one of the ways that Confucius is read is that he is an anti-metaphysician, that his philosophy does not require or does not depend upon metaphysical foundations, and that's very different to the way that things have been done in the West and in India, where basically you have a grand metaphysical theory, and then you derive from this theory, okay, so the world is like this, and therefore we should act this way. Confucius, the way I understand, does not do that move, but starts, it's the other way around. It starts already in the social world, and then
Yes.
working out what should be done through this social vision. And that makes it very attractive to a world where we're suspicious of metaphysics. So it makes it very attractive. But I'm not sure if that's the correct reading. I want to, if you could comment on that. So my question, to summarize, is: do you believe that Confucius does not depend at all on a metaphysical foundation?
Well, let me now speak as an amateur about this, and then we'll hear from Michael. But there was, of course, a metaphysical Neo-Confucianism in the Sung Dynasty, which tried to dress up Confucianism in a metaphysic. To my mind, it was a weakening rather than a strengthening of the position. And because it's true that Confucianism has this decisive, this worldly orientation that you referred to. And I think a similar thing could be said about the West. That's why I contrasted a moment ago philosophy to anti-philosophy. So the anti-philosophers, like Nietzsche and Pascal and Rousseau and Kierkegaard, were the ones who discounted, if they did not completely dismiss, this pretense of metaphysical foundations. And that opens the door to more originality in moral views. So I think of that as a strength rather than a weakness. Now, nevertheless, one could say that different large positions in philosophy, not a metaphysical system in a tight sense, but a set of large orientations and assumptions, can be more or less conducive to the development of these original moral ideas. And I do think that both of the dominant traditions in the history of world philosophy, the philosophy of deep structure and the philosophy of the timeless one, are burdens on our moral invention. And we're much better to develop the third position. So that's my complicated response to your question.
And yeah, I very much agree. So beginning precisely where Roberto did, when you get 19th century European discussions of Confucianism, basically what they're looking at is Song Neo-Confucianism. So Song Neo-Confucianism, as Roberto mentioned, is a Neo-Confucian movement beginning with a figure called Jushi that will spread throughout East Asia over the subsequent centuries. And it very much gives you this dramatically complicated metaphysical position based upon a claim that the world is coherent and we should live properly within that coherent world. That Jushi correctly saw this as a radical rejection of all previous Confucian traditions, except he thought Confucius and Mencius, who he claimed did hold this position. You've read a little bit of Confucius and Mencius. I would respectfully disagree with Jushi here. Yes, I would say the earlier traditions are radically different, and I very much agree. I think the power of a Confucius and Mencius and a Xunzi, the other figure we mentioned, although didn't read, is that they do not have, in fact, I'll put it even more strongly, they are opposed to a pre-given metaphysics. The idea is the ways we conceptualize the world defines our existence within it, and that's precisely one of the dangers, and therefore you're incredibly strongly urged to push against any claim that there is any kind of inherent existent structure. The degree to which we perceive a structure is the degree to which we are probably falling into patterns of thinking that will ultimately hold us back. And putting this into a larger comparative perspective, I very much agree with Roberto. If you're looking for positions that would hold that there really are not pre-given natural laws, there's not a pre-given structure to the cosmos, even the cosmos itself should not be seen as controlled by unchanging laws. If you're looking for examples of that within the history of world philosophy, one of the few examples is indeed the Confucian tradition as well, which very much holds that same position, and I agree. I think that's part of why it is now becoming, I think philosophically, we're at least arguing, one of the most powerful positions in a new articulated sense, precisely because it, like the self-fashioning argument, is opposed to a notion of a pre-given structure within which we need to live.
Yeah. So you could call it, you could give a fancy label to this third position in order just to establish a shallow equivalence to the other positions and call it a temporal naturalism. But I don't know what you would gain by that. So the temporal naturalism asserts those views with which I described earlier in the course, the third position. There's one real world. The most important thing about this one real world is that it is what it is, rather than something else. We can't deduce it from rational necessities the way that Leibniz, for example, tried to do. In this one real world, everything is temporal. Everything changes sooner or later, and is no less real because it is mutable. The new is possible, the really new, which is not just the realization of some antecedent possible state of affairs, but on the contrary, the basis for a new conception of possibility. History is open. It has no script. These are the views that I'm associating with the position that I'm calling temporal naturalism. Now, it's something of a mystery in the history of philosophy why this position, which on its face might seem to be the one with the best credentials to our allegiance, speaks with the weakest voice compared to the other positions. And we have to go to the 20th century to find philosophers like Bergson or Whitehead who have even some limited affinity with this third position.
So it all sounds a little bit depressing. It sounds like we're never going to get.
No, but I'm serious. Why is it depressing? Because
We're never going to resolve the contradiction between our consciousness and how we see the world. We're never going to bring together the ethics of self-fashioning and the ethics of connectedness. We're never going to bridge the gap.
so it's true, there are these recalcitrant contradictions in human experience. But I'm puzzled by why you call that depressing, because these contradictions are the reverse side of our openness, right? We're not puppets. We're not the instruments of some system. So,
Well, I mean, it's like when we're talking about how we've gone from a traditional worldview to transformation, and then with the domestication of all these transformative ideas, we are now slipping back into the traditional worldview. And now here we are trying to look for some more transformation to break out of this traditional worldview. But what's not to say that we're going to slip back into the
no, but wait a minute. We're saying, I think that in politics, there are very strong reasons to prefer some directions to others. This conception of the cognitive gap, I would not apply to politics. And I would say that now there's very strong reason to oppose institutionally conservative social democracy in favor of an alternative. And I defend a particular alternative. I don't think there are reasons of the same weight or conclusive force in our basic moral ideas about ourselves. And the reason for that is that these moral ideas are closer to the human condition, to our this opposition of nature to us, the darkness that surrounds us, these fundamental features of our situation in the world are much more closely revealed in these fundamental moral conceptions. And so it's not surprising that with respect to them, we are likely to have a much less confident sense of direction. Relatively, because the combination of these two ethics, why have we chosen these two ethics? The premise is not that they are just as good as any other ethics. There's a claim that we're making that the conversation, the conflict of these two ethics, or the dialogue between them, is a decisive element of our contemporary self-understanding. And they do have much in common. So, as I argued, behind them stand two major functional imperatives of the advanced societies: the enhancement of personal agency and the development of higher forms of cooperation. And that is a direction. And this direction is refracted through these alternative moral views. So I don't see that. It seems to me that that's actually a very defined and rich sense of hope. So hope is different from optimism. Optimism is a prediction. It's a contemplative and passive attitude. Hope is an existential orientation. And there's a fundamental difference between the psychology of optimism and the psychology of hope. So we think that hope is more the consequence of action than it is the cause of action. You engage, you discover transformative possibility where it seemed not to exist, and then you become hopeful. So you can act for any set of reasons. You can act out of indignation, out of a sense of injustice, out of hatred, out of impatience. But once you act, through action, you can become hopeful, because then you discover, through action, possibilities that were not revealed to you when you were passive. And that's so all of this view that we're describing, and this combination of views about politics and views about morals, are reasons for hope. I don't think we need to be led by the hand and put in a system and said, this is the way things have to be, and these are the rules, and those are your obligations to everyone else. This is the book of accounts, I brought it to you. We don't need any of that to be hopeful. That diminishes us. That treats us as children. We want to be free. So that's a different view.
I have a question about what you call temporal natural. The way I understand you is that under this view, things such as the laws of nature will also change
Yes.
over time. But wouldn't that just create a further question of why the laws change this way instead of the other?
Of course. There are a set of dilemmas, of puzzles that come with such a view. This is, in fact, can be called the dilemma of the meta laws. So if are there laws that govern the transformation of the laws? If there are, that's a problem. If there's not, there's also a problem, and so forth. So, of course, there's a set of contradictions that comes with this. But I think it is a fact now. I'm affirming that it is a fact that the universe is historical. Cosmology is a historical science. Now, what happens in the organization of physics is that cosmology is marginalized and treated as if it were just large-scale astronomy, rather than being the science of the whole universe. It is the science of the whole universe, and it is historical. Now, if the whole universe is historical, every single piece of it must also be historical. That's the logical conclusion. And there are a series of paradoxes that are implicit in the idea of a historical science, like the one you just referred to, which we would have to discuss. But so that's just the beginning of a long debate, but it's a different direction for science. So now we have this view of the fundamental science, fundamental physics, is at the apex of the organization of the sciences. The two dominant 20th century views in fundamental physics, relativity and quantum mechanics, emerged immediately before the discovery of the historical character of the universe in the 1920s. If the sequence had been reversed, the situation, the intellectual situation might look very different. But that's the situation. And the implications of the discovery of the historical character of the universe have not been fully processed by the dominant scientific ideas to this day. So, it's not as if we can't take a lot of this stuff for granted. In other words, I mean, the university culture is based on the forced marriage of methods and subject matters, as I suggested in an earlier class. So evolutionary biology is treated by a historical method. Fundamental physics is an anti-historical method. Economics is not the study of the economy. It's the study of a method pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. So this is the academy. This is the system of the university culture. Now, one of the reasons to philosophize is to tear the academy down, right? So that, so it's just ridiculous. So that's the system. The national curriculums that exist in the world. The United States doesn't really have a national curriculum, but most countries do. The national curriculums that exist in the world are infantilizations of the university culture.